a bit of background on myself. I'm actually a science graduate, and a couple of years ago I decided to try and reskill and become a software developer. So everything I've kind of picked up along the way is things I've learned from like the likes of Coursera, Code Academy, going to the tutorials in kind of Python Ireland, and just kind of picking up experience along the way and on the job as well. So with that in mind, I've always kind of found it exciting to try and build a website, but then think about it and I'm like, how the hell do you do it? So with that, I decided then, right, for all of the other people that are, you know, just getting started into Python, and this is a beginner's talk, so if you guys have done web development and you're going, Jesus, this is so low level and I'm just like wasting my time, just go on your phones, that's fine, I won't get upset. But at the end, you should pay attention a little bit, because at the end, instead of questions, really, we're going to do questions and suggestions. So if I've missed something that you think is really key, let me know, okay? And then we'll add it in, because I'll have these slides up available for people to kind of download and use as a guide if they want to kind of like build a website, okay? So my disclaimer is done. Cool. I've also been given a new laptop because my laptop doesn't have technology advanced enough for this situation. Last year it would have been fine. Okay, cool. So stages of web development, right. So you normally go through this point. Normally you're sitting in a pub with a group of friends and you're like, yeah, I'm going to build a website. I've got a really cool idea. I know some Python and I've messed around with HTML and CSS. Great. You install it, you're sitting there and you're like, right, what do I do next? And then you're like thinking, you start Googling stuff. You see, I didn't want to write Google on all my slides, so I set a search engine because you may want to DuckDuckGo it. But you get to this point where you're like, right, there seems to be a lot of stuff involved. And then very quickly you get on to the next point where you're like, oh shit, what have I got myself into? So the fear is real when you've committed to a project and you're like, right, I have to do this now, so what can I do? All of these words are now floating around in your head and you're like, oh, how do I put all this together? So this talk is trying to just give a brief outline. You can kind of use this as a checklist to kind of build up your website and then come back to it if you forgot anything. So we're not going to go too in-depth into anything, but these are kind of really important concepts that you can learn as you start your project, and you can bring it with you when you go to a workplace. Bear in mind, when you go to a workplace, you probably won't have to worry about any of these things, really, especially like the deployment, some of the version control. They'll probably have that all there if they're, you know, a well-established business. So you don't need to worry about the end part. But planning and organizing, very exciting, but very, very important. So this is kind of like when you're first coming up to your project and you're trying to think, right, I kind of have an idea of what it is. You should really sit down, think about the structure. What are the features that you want this project to have? And try and put them into kind of their separate compartments and think of them as sort of separate apps within kind of like your main app. And just write down the functionality that you need. For each of your features then, you want to break it down into smaller features of that feature, and then you should start building task lists. So if you're in a company, you're probably going to have Jira or some similar software. It's not free, you have to buy it. Each of those links that we have there will bring you to further information on what it is we're talking about. So in companies, you're going to probably have Jira. You'll learn how to write stories, and they'll relate into your epics, and these are what's going to be your features and kind of like part of your apps. If you're on your lonesome or you're working with a couple of guys in college, you're probably going to use Trello. This is great actually, because it gives you a Kanban board and you can go and read all about it, and you can move your tasks across and you can visualize how the group is working on each of the tasks. Again, it's a very important part of the project is sitting down for at least a week at the beginning and just discussing what it is you want to do. Write it all down. Don't even think about touching code. Don't even think about touching an IDE. Just sit down and get it written down. And then you can start to kind of like go into the code. And even then you should be just still thinking about how your code will actually fit together. So it might seem mundane, but it's the most important part. So then you're like, right, I have my planning out. I know what I want to do. What kind of web frameworks as well should we use? So you're still coming at this from a point where you've never really heard too much about Python web frameworks. So these are kind of the couple, if you Google Python web frameworks, these are generally the top couple of ones you're going to see information about. So I created a table, which doesn't quite fit on this slide because it's not created on this type of computer. But so we've got Django would be the one that is quite a popular web framework, but I'm not sure if I would recommend it as like such a beginner introduction, because there's loads of like I've divided into pros and cons, right? And you can see that loads of inbuilt features is in both boxes, because while it's great and it handles a lot of stuff for you, like kind of connecting sort of your views to your URLs and stuff, that can also kind of abstract the idea of how all this works, and you might miss out on some kind of like key understanding about how your website is built and communicating. So it's great, but it's also a bit of a con as well. However, it does have a very active community, and the guys are really friendly. So you want to get involved with them, and you'll be able to kind of ask questions and find out loads of information. There's loads of documentation, and there's loads of tutorials. So like there's a good amount of information that you can read and find out answers. If you go to Stack Overflow, there's heaps of questions and answers about Django, so you won't be too stuck. But I have put in the cons a bit of a steep learning curve, because there's a lot of things to remember, and there's a few kind of gotchas that you mightn't realize. Flask, micro framework, this is kind of what I've started with. This is what we use in work as well. But this is not really recommended for large applications, but if this is your first website, it's probably not a large application. So this could be something that's actually suitable for what your needs are, right? The docs are good, and it is easy to find answers in Stack Overflow again. So again, they say it's not recommended for larger projects, but for single-page applications, it seems to be working out fine. Pyramid, again, it's very similar to Flask in the kind of like micro-framework aspect. There's not as many documentation that I can find floating around about it, and again, there's less examples. You probably get a few more examples from the likes of Flask than you would for Pyramid, which when you're first embarking on kind of like web development, you want loads of examples, because you're probably going to copy and paste a lot of code as well. Tornado, this is for kind of real-time applications. Like it says there, it provides a continuous listening service, but you may want to avoid that until you get your handle on kind of like just building a normal web application. But keep it in mind, it's there for future use when you want to advance. So virtual environments, right? First Python application, you probably haven't thought about this. There's loads of different things with Python that you can install and break and like just destroy your web app as you start to build it. But luckily, virtual env is there for you to create a safe environment in which you can do this. This is your safe place to install code that's going to break everything. So you read through the docs. What you do is you create your virtual environment. You install everything you need for your project into that virtual environment so it's nice and contained. If you break it, cool, delete it, and then start again. And that's a really nice way to not destroy your computer. I have met people who have broken their computers from installing loads and loads of things, and just they're not able to clean it up properly. So virtual env, keep things in a nice little safe place. And again, there's loads of information on Python 2 installation. Python 3, you just have to remember that it's Python 3, because by default, when you go for stuff with virtual env, it'll default to running Python 2 in there. So you want to just keep an eye on that. APIs, right? I didn't know if I should mention this, but you're going to find it. As soon as you start building a web app, you'll see the word API floating around there. In a really, really, really basic way of saying it, it is a way of accessing some data. So somewhere out there, developers have decided, oh, we've got this cool thing going on, but we don't want to give you direct access to all of this code we've created, but we're just going to create a layer on top of it with kind of like functions you can call that will give you access to the code underneath without you having to go in and see their like original libraries and stuff. So I've given an example of a couple of different kind of like APIs that are available where you can go and read the documentation, figure out how it works, and get on with it. There's also a link there to some API documentation. A lot of these slides as well will have resources following them. So again, with the whole concept of this as like a guide that you can use as you embark on your project, there's resources here as well, because you need them. Folder structure. Maybe this should have come first, along with kind of like the planning and stuff. But within your application, right, it's very easy to start building out a project and a web app and just put your folders everywhere. And you're like, where should my files go? Where does all my Python go? Why does a file go there? When you're building out with Django, it actually helps you quite a lot. So when you start building a Django app, there's a set of commands that you can continuously run. And one of them will help build a folder structure for you, so you don't even have to worry about it. do keep your CSS and JavaScript and HTML files kind of separate and clean, and then you can easily refer to them within your actual code. So I've just given a screenshot of kind of how it should look. So if you're kind of like going back on, oh, where should all my folders go? You know that your CSS, images, JavaScript, they're going to go somewhere called static. If you see static when you're floating around in somebody else's code base, you see static files and stuff like that, you immediately should start thinking like, it's going to be where I find my CSS and my JavaScript. If you see templates, you're thinking HTML, and all of the rest of the kind of things that are associated, like so templates and any of the extensions that they might have. REST. Oh, why did I even put in this slide, right? REST is a concept, right? It's kind of like an architecture for how you build web applications. You'll start to Google it, and there's heaps and heaps of documentation around it, and it's very difficult to find a succinct way of explaining it. But I think Alan was sitting down talking about it earlier, and he was saying that essentially it's building a web app that doesn't continuously store a session. So his way of explaining it is that, like, if you have an application where you've got maybe 3 steps, so 1, you're filling out a form, you're putting in a billing address, and 2, you're doing your kind of like financial transaction. If at any point the server in which holds the code goes down or something, you don't want that session to be completely finished and all the data lost and you start again. So the idea of REST is that you build your application so all of the kind of the details of a session for the user is stored on the client side, and then as you progress through each steps, at each step, so like step 1, you'll send the information, the client's information back to the server, and then step 2, you'll send the client information back to the server for both step 1 and 2, kind of keeping it compartmentalized so that if at any point something in the back end goes down, you've still got all of the information saved for your session. It's a huge topic. That's the aim of the game, is that's what you're trying to achieve, and then they have these constraints that are listed here that you use to achieve that state. So again, I've included a lot of resources available to go in and read about REST. To be honest, like, I develop like this and I don't even realize that that's how I'm developing. And then when I kind of said I'd do this talk, I was like, shit, I should go and look up REST specifically. So there's a brief definition, but I'm not going to read them out because that's death by PowerPoint. So we'll move on. HTTP methods. These are intrinsically linked into REST, all right? Just listing them here, again, beginner's talk, you may not have seen these, right? So this is like kind of essentially the server side will communicate with the client side. And by server, I mean like where all your kind of like Python code is held, your database, and then it'll communicate with the client side, which is your kind of UI, your interface, where your user is going to be. So your client makes requests and receives responses from your servers. And then again, protocols. You might get these mixed up, like you'd be Googling there for HTTP methods, thinking you're going to find stuff about protocols. This is something I commonly do. And so your protocols are actually linked to the numbers. So these are the kind of the numbers that you're going to see if you get like responses. So if you look in your JavaScript or if you look in the logs of your app, you'll generally find like 200s, loads of 200s, not so many 404s, maybe a few forbiddens, and hopefully no 500s. So you can go ahead. I have, again, more resources further on to explain a lot more about these kind of protocols. There's like giant documentation about this. These are courses in themselves, and I've just put it all onto one slide, but just be aware of them as you go ahead on your journey. These are some of the resources. So again, W3 Schools, if you're new to this and you are trying to do a website, W3 Schools is going to be great. The guys earlier in our keynote was talking about the Mozilla Developer Network. That's also great for kind of tutorials around your kind of like HTML, CSS, and pretty much everything web. It's actually a fantastic resource, and I didn't put a link to it here. I'll add it for when people want the slides. Testing. Straight back into Python, right? I haven't listed all of the testing libraries in Python because there's loads of them, but just get this into your head that like the idea of testing your code is really important. You want to save yourself heartache and stress going after, like, is my site running in production? Can I tell if anything's broken in it? So by having kind of like tests that are able to notify you of like essentially the health of your code, you want to make sure that you build this out as you're developing the project. As soon as you start looking at tests in Python, you're going to start hitting up like TDD, which is like test-driven development method. Harry Percival, who normally speaks here but isn't here this year and always wears a hat, he's actually written a couple of books on test-driven development at this point. So if you Google him, you'll find a HTTP or a free text version online. Oh yeah, running out of time. But yeah, so the kind of types of tests you want to be testing, right? With your code, a unit test is something you'll hear a lot about. Essentially, this unit test does exactly what it says. It tests like the functionality of your code. So if you have a small function, you want to test what happens when I pass the correct data, what happens when I pass incorrect data, what happens if I pass no data. But the thing about unit tests is they shouldn't be, like let's say you've got a function that calls a database, right? You should try not and have your unit test calling the actual database because you're going to put like if your project starts to expand, you'll end up like your test will take ages to run, and you can also end up like overloading a database with essentially test requests, which really you don't want to do. So there is a mocking library where you can fake all of these requests out to servers and stuff. That is an art unto itself. But once you get the hang of mocking, it's pretty awesome because you can test almost anything you want to do. Integration tests, however, are slightly different. You can still use unit tests to do them, but the idea of integration tests is to check, you know, essentially the full stack. How does everything connect? Is something that I'm requesting for the database here, like is it doing what it's meant to do? And so you're aiming to test the full stack here. Integration tests take longer, but they're worth it because you can test the type of data you're receiving. You can make sure that you are receiving data. You could build notifications of it. Your front-end tests. Sometimes you might find that a job can be running, right? And your web app is technically running. Everything seems fine. But you go onto your URL and there's nothing there. And you're like, how is this happening? Why is there nothing telling me that there's nothing here? So front-end tests are really, really great, especially if you've got like users who like are global users and you are, you know, in Ireland. You want to know if something goes wrong so you can fix it immediately. And so you can build like just tests to make sure that all of your DOM objects are sitting there so that there is like the body has been loaded. You can use it to check that your search functionality is still working in your test. There's no limit except your imagination. So for this front-end test with Selenium, and then Behave is another thing that adds onto it where you can actually write your front-end tests using very Englishy language. So check out Dave Macauley's talk from last year where he goes into Behave. There's another resource for you. And we're coming up, version control. This is the way that you can control the versions of your project that you have. So you might have version 1, 1.1, everything's going great, and then you release 1.2 and it breaks everything. Did you save it? Where, like, can you go back? So version control is there to solve that problem. We've got two kind of main methods of kind of storing code that when you Google, these are kind of the first two you're going to come across. So GitHub is a place where you can store public repositories. Everybody can see everything, and you can pay for the private stuff, or if you're a student, you get a couple of free private repositories, which is nice. Bitbucket does a lot of private repositories. It's up to you which one you want to use. They both do kind of very similar things, but obviously there's a lot more information out there. Resources. Git is a language in which you can use to push your code to Bitbucket and GitHub, but you might want to learn about it. I think GitHub also has a UI, but you don't get the full functionality, so it's worth learning how you're going to use your command line to push the code up to GitHub. It takes a little bit of time, but there's a couple of cheat sheets, and again, there's a community there that you can talk to, or just reach out to the Python community, because we're always doing it as well, and people are friendly. Deployment and hosting. The main things you want to think about when you're going from kind of working in development into production is your environment setup. First, set debug to not true, because you don't want that, and update your environment settings. Switch DBs if it's required. So if you're using SQLite in your development environment, but you're going to be using Postgres in your production environment, you want to remember that, otherwise you'll go with the wrong database. These are two examples of places where you can do Python hosting pretty easily. You can check them out. And what next? the community, right? So when you're starting to embark on kind of like this web development process, the best resources that you have really are kind of like here. It's coming to these kind of events. It's going to your Python Ireland meetups, or I know in Paul, you guys run a Carlo IT kind of tech meetup as well. So like there's something everywhere. So a place to go to find out about these is meetup.com. So you can go in and just Google tech meetups or Python meetups and join them, come along, learn for free and kind of meet the people working in the industry and just ask them questions. This is literally how I got into development, was just going to kind of Python meetups and figuring stuff out that way. And one, you'll be able to ask the questions, figure out the code, have a good time, and two, you get to meet employers as well. So if you're not there yet, you can ask the people that you're looking to work with, what is it that I need to get me there? And then you can go off and do it. So it's really nice. And then if you feel like you're not being so social or you don't want to talk to anybody, you can always go online and go for the usual resources. At this point, they're quite familiar to everybody. Quick Google for like online tutorials will bring you up with the list that I have there. Go to Stack Overflow. Whenever you Google a question, your first result is going to be something from Stack Overflow generally. And learn the vocabulary to search for your answers. So the same way that I was always mixing up HTTP protocols and methods, like you're going to get different responses for that. So really try and remember what it is you're actually searching for. And if you forget, ask somebody. And if it all goes to, hell, and it's just not going to work out for you, and you really need to build your own website, you can go to WordPress. WordPress does offer, decent enough website. There's loads of plugins, and you can forget the stress of building your own website and go and learn something else, and then you can kind of come back to it. At this point, like for development and working in these environments, you don't have to build websites. You have stuff available for you, and there's so many other things that you can learn. So that's it from me. I hope it was of benefits to some people here, and I'll go on to questions and suggestions.
So yes, any questions or suggestions?
Hey, thanks very much. I just wanted to say that GitLab is a great alternative to GitHub and Bitbucket. You can either host your code with them on their website, or you can actually self-host. So it's,
cool.
Check it out.
Any more suggestions?
In terms of online resources, I wanted to mention that there's also a plural site for courses, but it is indeed paid.
There's a what is?
Pluralsite.com.
Poro site.
Plural site.
Pluralsite, yes.
Yeah.
Probably forgot it.
And for online chatting with other people, maybe Stack Overflow is not the best resource because they tend to be a bit elitist.
There can be a couple of trolls on it.
Yeah, so then you can go to like Slack channels where people are more friendly, or IRC from Freenode.
Yeah, there's a Tech Ireland Slack channel, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just in terms of what is REST, Martin Fowler has a great blog article called, I think it's the Richardson Maturity Model. It's not necessarily for beginners of web development, but I think if you're starting off web development, you shouldn't worry about REST to start off with. But that blog article kind of explains quite succinctly, some of the key points of REST.
Cool.